So by way of introduction, Richard is an innovator, educator, and a best-selling author, and has been described as one of the most inspirational leaders of his generation. He argues, however, that great leadership is about serving the needs of the people that work for you and rely upon you. There are three core principles that underpin Richard's philosophy, and they are communication, empowerment, and impact. Richard is one of the most celebrated speakers in the world, and his insights into change, leadership, and education are unique thanks to his own extraordinary journey, which has seen him go from being a struggling actor, copywriter, real estate agent, to becoming an award-winning school principal and now best-selling author, award-winning speaker and advisor to high-performing corporate and sports organisations. So Richard, a very, very warm welcome to you today. I know it's very early on the other side of the world, so we really appreciate you getting up early and joining us today.
It's so good to be here. And honestly, don't worry, the sun's shining for once here. So 7 o'clock in the morning is not as miserable as it can sometimes be.
Right, that's fantastic to hear that the sun's shining in England. Very good. So let's kick off sort of with, what did we sort of touched a little bit about your sort of really interesting career path and all the different journeys you've taken. So when you were little, what did you want to be when you grew up and why?
Well, there were two things really that I wanted to be as a child. The first, funnily enough, was to be a lawyer. So I wanted to be a lawyer or an actor. And I've always been passionate about writing. So I remember saying to my mum when I was a little child, you have those chats with your parents. They sit you down and they say, so what are you going to be? And I said to my mum, I'd love to act and write if I could when I'm older. But lawyer was the first thing. But that didn't last very long because when my parents were getting divorced, my mum got quite friendly with her lawyer. And so I went and spent a couple of weeks just shadowing her lawyer and realized actually it wasn't the glamour of the courtroom. It was really hard work. So I was then left with actor, which is really what I wanted to do right the way through until I realized the flaw in my master plan, which came, when I left school, I actually got into repertory theatre on the outskirts of London and thought I was going to be Olivier. I thought it was going to be the new superstar. Until, again, the big flaw in that plan came along, which proved to be critical, which was I really wasn't that good at it. So those were the things I wanted to be, and then ended up going to, finally, I think to my mother's relief, finally deciding to go to university. And that's where my life really changed, which I think we might come on to.
Yeah, so I suppose leading on from that and sort of finding your way to university, what sort of were, pivotal moments in your life that have really affected and sort of, I suppose, formed the course of direction that you've now taken?
Well, so much of my life has been fatal, like fate, and things just seem to have happened, really. So I went to university and wanted to, I chose subjects to study because I still wanted a career in the arts, really. But in my first year at university, I met a young woman who I absolutely fell head over heels for, and was desperate to score a date with. And she was training to be a teacher, and because I'd spent a couple of years before going to college after school trying to do this acting and what have you, she was coming towards the end of her degree, and we started dating in the summer of her final year and the summer at the end of my first year. Anyway, in order to score a date, so she was training to be a teacher, she was about to become a teacher. I remember sitting with her one night in the student union bar and saying, "Oh, teaching's amazing. What you're going to do is amazing." Anyway, I did score a date with her, and it went quite well. Thank you. And to kind of very long story short, we're about to celebrate our 27th wedding anniversary, 30th year together. So it's worked out okay. But you see, she's a smart woman. And she realized when I came to the end of my normal degree, she actually decided to hold me to account, and so enrolled me on a teacher training course. after my degree. So that's how I got into education. And it was because of her. So yeah, the last 30 years of my life have been pretty much dominated by that moment, and because of the drive of that very special lady.
Yeah, what a fantastic story. Congratulations on 27 years. There's not a lot of people that can actually say that these days, so well done.
Yeah, I think she's the one that deserves congratulations.
So for you at the moment, given everything that's going on in the world, what's sort of an average day looking like for you, and how are you managing and coping during COVID-19?
Well, I mean, as for a lot of us, for so many of us in different walks of life and different areas, the world just kind of dropped off a cliff
Yeah,
a
it
month
did.
ago. And particularly for somebody like me who spends their life traveling around and speaking and doing all that kind of stuff. But I very quickly, I went through the same phases I think everybody did. That idea, first of all, of denial, of seeing this thing in the distance and thinking, oh, that's not gonna. In fact, my last main event, I was in Australia, and I remember sitting there watching some of the news from Oz, and then flying home and thinking, oh, this is on the other side of the world. And then so you go through that denial, and then all those phases of sheer panic, and suddenly just trying to do too much too quickly. Just say, I've got to do something. That fear of suddenly feeling a lack of control and just going into overdrive, trying to scrabble somehow a way of feeling in control. And eventually I arrived at this place where I thought this is how things are going to be. The most important thing is to build a routine. So I try to get up early. My wife's a school principal, and I don't know if those watching from abroad know, but over here, although schools are closed to most students, they're still open for the children of key workers. So I still get up with my wife early in the morning. I'll go for a long walk, come back, sit here in my home office and do something, try and be productive. So I'm trying to do as many things like this, podcasts, writing, blogs, because the really important thing for me is to feel that I'm having a productive time every day, something that feels professional, focused, something that makes me feel like I'm accomplishing something. And then apart from that, as I was saying to you before we started, we've got living with us at the moment, obviously not just my wife, my daughter who's a teacher, and my son whose university course is suspended currently. And so he's working, stacking shelves in a local supermarket to keep that stocked. So kind of, I've become the kind of the carer for the family, because I'm pushing big brave Richard's pushing his family out onto the front line, and I'm kind of staying at home and doing the cooking and the cleaning and trying to keep the place running for everybody, which I'm loving actually.
Yes, very brave of you.
Yeah, I know. Come on, I deserve a medal. Honestly, you should see the toilets; they've never been so clean.
So what really sort of drives you to do what you do, and sort of what makes you tick? Like what sort of really makes you want to get up in the morning and get on with it?
For me, it's always been the same. And everything that's ever driven me since I really started my career in education all those years ago is people. Nothing, and I know it sounds corny, nothing gives me greater pleasure than seeing people thrive and develop and come through challenges. In my days as a teacher, working with students in my class, and often the students that were finding stuff really hard, right the way through to working with organizations over the last decade. For me, it's all about human beings and seeing human potential thrive and develop. And so to an extent, I still feel that very, very keenly. It may be even more keenly now during what we're going through, that if I have a role, and I have very limited skills, I don't really have an awful lot to offer. I'm not a medic. I don't, my sister's part of the vaccinology team at Imperial. I've got friends and family who are doing extraordinary things. And I think what I get up for every morning is to think, well, can I help people make sense of this? Can I help people make sense of the changes we're going through, both in the short term and the longer term? as an educator and somebody passionate about education, can I help people make sense of the process of what our kids are going through, what our schools are going through, and also how we come out of this, the other side, because we will. And I think what's really interesting is it goes back to what I said in one of my previous answers. In order for none of us to feel like we're just victims of circumstance and fate right now, one of the things we need to be doing is being optimistic. And I'm not talking about kind of happy, clappy, let's all just get up every morning and yay, the world's going to be great. But actually, by focusing on what we can learn from what we're living through now and what we can do to make sure when we come out of the other side, we don't look back on this period as a missed opportunity. You know, one of the things I wrote a couple of weeks ago was, for me, for some of us who aren't on the front line, seconds have become minutes, minutes have become hours, hours have become days. And what we don't want to do when the world becomes crazy again and back to some semblance of normality is think, my God, I wish we'd used that time to actually look at how we can recalibrate when we move forward and the world opens up again. And I think that's particularly true of education. I think it's true in the business climate and the corporate world and in our personal lives too. So I guess it's been a very long-winded answer, and what I'm trying to do is just try and catalyze the right kind of thinking for people and help galvanize that idea for people.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of jump into a little bit on education now, because I know there are a number of people on the call with an educational background, and teachers included. So, you know, education is the most important factor determining the future of our children, economy, and society. How do we prepare the young for the future given the current environment we are in? Because one would have to assume that something like this will probably happen again in maybe 10, 20, 30 years or whatever. But for many people out there, particularly the younger kids that are at school, have never experienced anything like this before in their life. So how do we go about preparing them?
Well, I think there are two or three phases to this, really. I think the first is in the immediate first term, the first point of action. And by the way, you know, what we've seen in the last couple of weeks from educators is truly miraculous. I mean, when you think about the way the world's had to change, and the speed at which our education professionals, teachers, teaching assistants, admin staff have adapted to that new world, keeping their children at the front and center of every decision and policy is truly remarkable. And if I ever hear again from anybody outside of education that teachers aren't this, can't do that, you know, what we've seen is an entire profession reinvent itself very, very quickly. But I think once we start to come through that phase, so by the way, that's the first thing. What I want is for our educators to have unbelievable levels of self-confidence based on what they've just done, because I often think as a profession we're cursed with kind of feeling we're never doing enough, or we could always be doing more, or somehow everybody else might have the answer. I think what we've proved alongside our health professionals in the last few weeks is that the educators are the very best of us, and I want us as a profession to carry that forward. I think the first thing moving forward as we reintegrate our kids back into a routine of face-to-face education is we have to remember, think long and hard, that we can't just go back into a normal, we can't just start a timetable, academic learning, curriculum. We're going to have to think very long and hard about the emotional reintegration and induction of both our students and our staff back into our schools, because every one of our children, every single member of staff will have lived through a very different experience of the last few weeks, and we're going to have to make sure that we prepare people emotionally to get back into that very collegiate kind of formal environment. You know, whether it's people experiencing loss, whether it's people and children who've experienced parents or carers or family members who have lost jobs and suddenly their entire lives have changed, whether it's some people that have experienced the joy of being able to free range their brains over the last few weeks and months and operate in a very different way. It would be a huge mistake to think we've just got to get back on it as quickly as possible. So I think there's a lot of consideration there for schools and school communities to think about. But in the longer term, I think the really interesting thing here is something that a lot of us have been saying for a long time, which is the world is changing fast, it's changing exponentially, it will never slow down, and it will never be fixed. You know, we're never going to get to a point where everything just goes back to normal, whether it's a recurrence of a virus, whether it's the economic challenge that is going to, I mean, it was bad enough after the global crisis, but it's going to be even more amplified moving forwards, whether it's the environmental issues that our children are still going to be the generation that are going to have to deal with. What we have to ask is, how are we going to redesign an education system that isn't predicated on preparing children for certainty, but is now based on how we make sure that our children are prepared to live in worlds of deep uncertainty and exponential change. And that means we're going to have to ask very long and hard questions, I think, about what we teach and how we teach it. And I think, you know, that's the truth, because the idea that we can continue to prepare generations to live lives of certainty has become more and more precarious. But I think this is almost the final straw. And I think, by the way, it's one of the reasons we're seeing so much, before this even, such a rise globally in populism, in anger and hatred and division around the world, because we saw generations who were prepared and promised lives of certainty starting to live out lives that weren't. And I think if we're going to help people cope better with that flow, as educators, we have to think long and hard about what kind of world we're preparing our young people for.
I think that I totally agree with you, actually, but I also think that, you know, sort of coming out of this, what do you think students are really going to value? And I think that there will be a change in expectations, and you probably sort of touched on it moving forward. And do you think that, you know, we'll start to see a shift of online learning from a school sort of level? What do you think will come out of this?
I think there'll be more confidence in using online learning. I've always believed that online learning is one part of education. It's an important part. And for years, by the way, it's been a very informal part. You know, our kids, those who have had access to technology, have for years, whether it's formal or informal, whether it's whether we wanted them to learn or not, they have been involved in online learning in a very advanced level. You know, I often tell the story, I won't tell it in full now, of my son learning to speak Russian because he started playing a soccer game on his Xbox with a kid in Russia 4 or 5 years ago, and learned to speak Russian through that interaction and that relationship, right? So our kids have been doing this stuff for a very long time. I think one of the things we do need to remember in all of this, and it goes back to something that Eric Schmidt, the former executive chairman of Google, once told me when I asked him years ago about whether technology would replace the teacher. His answer was unequivocal and immediate. And he said, no, never. And I said, well, from you, that's quite why? And he said, because you have to understand that education has always been about the development of human beings. And in order to develop human beings primarily, you need high levels of human interaction. And I think that's incredibly true. I think what we can do is start to see the power of online learning as a tool, and a tool to help us do the stuff that maybe we as educators in our school buildings need to spend less time on, which hopefully can free us up to be more about the development of the three-dimensional human being and our children again, which in many ways is what most of us came into the job to do in the first place. I think the other challenge that you mentioned is the expectations of our children. And I think one of the things that's really important to bear in mind there, and I think educators have always known it, policymakers less so, our children are not intrinsically lazy. They are not adverse to learning. They are not adverse to development. You know, we learn more in the first 5 years of our life than we do in the rest of our lives put together. So the critical thing with young people is to make sure that the learning is of value to them. It feels rich in context and it's experiential. One of the things that we've started to see over the last number of years with our children, just for the nature of the society in which they live, is that they are the most sophisticated, active consumers the world's ever seen. They don't do anything passively, and they don't expect to, and that's true in the workplace and in education. And
Right.
again, one of the great challenges, and I think this has exacerbated that because kids in many ways have had much freer opportunity to do things in their own way, in their own environment. We
Mm.
have to respect the fact that they are demanding because they expect interactivity. And I think whilst we need to make sure we help children still maintain an understanding of the rules of society, I think, you know, we can exploit that. We can exploit the fact they're active developmental citizens and that they need to be allowed to self-manage more. So I think one of the things we need to consider is, excuse me, how we rein back on the feeling we have to control everything. And actually we need to trust them more and allow them to self-manage more.
Mm. I'm just going to give a call out. If anybody's got any questions for Richard, please just pop them in the chat area and we'll come to those shortly. But, you know, one of the questions we had a bit of a chat about the other day in terms of what we were going to talk about today was, you know, here in Australia for certainly the next term, and I'm talking probably more specifically for Victoria because I think some of the other states are a little bit different, but, you know, there's going to be a whole term of homeschooling, and the homeschooling is going to be done by parents. And, you know, parents already have their own challenges, you know, in terms of what's going on in their life and now trying to manage the whole homeschooling. Do you think that in the longer term, from an educational perspective, that kids will be disadvantaged because of it from a learning perspective?
I think we're about to see a broadening of inequality. And I think that's going to be one of our greatest challenges. You know, I think that children who are in, I don't want to put a kind of quantifier on it, good, bad, or indifferent, but children who are in settled environments, who have access to technology, who have parents that have got a really good professional regime in their own lives and structure, I think will come out of this okay. In fact, I think they'll probably come out of it grown. I think many of them. My real worry is the inequality for those children who aren't in those environments, either because they don't have access to technology, they're in homes which are far less organized, far less filled with love. And I think that could well be the greatest challenge we face as a society moving on from the homeschooling environment, that actually the divide between the haves and the have-nots is going to be massive. And I think we need to be very cognizant about how we, not just in schools, because I think this is going to be too big just for schools and teachers to be expected to handle, how we help rebalance that. Because otherwise, I think, you know, we hear a lot of high drama about the lost generation. I don't think it's going to be the lost generation at all. But I think an element of this generation could be more lost than any other. And so I think that's a critical thing for us to think about.
Yeah, really, really insightful. I'm going to throw to a couple of questions, Richard, if that's okay. So,
Of course, yeah.
as question from Alistair, do you think that with COVID-19 and the change in the value of learning through this process, that governments and departments will modify curriculums more in the future to enhance children's self-management and engagement in learning?
Alistair, I really hope so. You know, I said quite early on that I think we first of all have to take heart in realizing what we've always known as educators, that the profession itself are truly remarkable and that they have been overmanaged for far too long. And we need to get policymakers to operate under far more of what I call an assumption of excellence with our educators rather than an assumption of incompetence. And I hope what that means is we are freer to act as the catalyst for designing a richer, broader curriculum that takes account of all of the things we've talked about this morning. And I think what's really important is that design of future curriculum should be more collegiate. So it shouldn't be to policymakers, it shouldn't just be in the hands of educators. But what we should now be doing is ensuring that parents, carers, businesses, everyone involved in community. You know, for years I've shared the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. And what I hope is that we start to take that seriously in terms of curricular design in the future.
Awesome. And this question's from Rachel. Do you have any recommendations on how we can empower university students to take advantage of the situation that they are now in and keep them on track with improving their skills and working towards the future? I think you referenced that you actually have a child at university, so you're probably well placed to answer this.
Oh yeah, tell me about it. You know, and my son, the problem with my son is he's one of those infuriating people who just is too laid back for his own good, but always seems to manage to get done what needs to get done, which as a parent drives us crazy. But what we have said to him, and I suppose it's an advice where others are capable of doing it, is, again, it goes back to something I said, which was broader. You know, I said, don't be a victim of this, Andrew. Don't sit there and wait for your online lectures to come in and your coursework to be done. Use this time to experience something else. And it's why, actually, he went out and applied for a job stacking shelves in a local supermarket. And I think that is going to help him grow. Forget the fact that what he's doing is of value and he's earning a few pounds towards his next semester at university. He is growing from that experience by doing something that he's never done before, out of his comfort zone, that is really supportive and helpful in a career and profession he would probably never have otherwise touched from the inside. And also, he's one of those people, I think, that is going to develop huge amounts of self-confidence and human interaction skills from that experience. So one of the things I would be saying is encourage students at university, whether you're as a parent, a carer, whether you're at university itself, to use this time to go out and do something of value and of use, and maybe try and pick up some skills and experiences they've never had before, because it is going to hold them in unbelievable stead moving forwards.
Okay, really good feedback. Okay, so here's maybe a bit of a curly one, Richard. So okay, you ready? So how do we shift out of a school culture driven by a national curriculum into a learning climate driven by children? How do we do the things you were saying and shift policymakers into a different field?
Well, I think there are a number of things. It's a great question, by the way. And I wish I had a magic wand to be able to do that. But a number of things based on my own experience of when I was a school principal and we kind of broke the rules and got away with it. And also other things that I think are really, first of all, we cannot wait for policymakers to catch up. They never will. There's no point in even trying. With all due respect to politicians, they're not in it for the same reasons we are. They're there to make sure that they secure a second term and a third term. So their entire focus is on getting results quick and being able to share them. And therefore, it's all about easy measures, easy to implement stuff. What we have to do as a profession is gain the courage to be activists again. We need to be doing stuff underneath, if you like, the policy radar. We need to realize in our schools that we just have to use the gaps and the spaces we have to do the things that really matter. I've always believed that if you can answer 3 fundamental questions as an educator, I think it gives you the confidence to go to war if we need to with people that question you. And that is, do you really know the needs of your children? What are you doing to meet the needs of your children and prove you've met the needs of your kids? And I think as a profession, if we keep rehearsing those 3 things, we can demonstrate rigor and focus on everything that we do. And actually, it frees us up with confidence to do the things we believe in. I also believe that the way we get policy to shift isn't through policymakers, it's through democracy and voters. And there are millions and millions of voters who are parents and prospective parents. And if we can show them the power of what the alternative looks like, and they can start demanding different from policymakers at the time of manifestos and elections, then things start to shift. And I think that's the point. Focus on our children, make sure our parents and carers realize what we're doing is deeply of value, and then we shift it that way.
Great answer. Maybe one more question, and then I've got a couple of questions just to finish up because I'm just mindful of time. So what do you consider as a possible approach to teaching Indigenous students who have no access to internet and are also going through isolating conditions due to this coronavirus. This is from Liliana.
Wow, I mean, it's a great question, and I have to confess, obviously, you know, the Indigenous community in a country like Australia is one I don't have a great experience of. What I would suggest is that you stay in contact as much as you can with those students, whether it's by phone, whether it's how you do it. You have to find a way to stay in contact. I would rather than set them tasks and work which is unable to be done because of the lack of technology, maybe because of the lack of support at home. It's about asking questions about what they are learning. So what they're able to do is process the experiences they're having. And if you ask the right kind of skilled questions, they can start to process their everyday experiences and turn them into things that can be of use and value in learning. So rather than telling them what to do, it's listening to what they're doing in their lives and asking questions of those experiences so they start to see them in a broader context. You know, as I said before, I wish I had an answer to this because I do think it's going to be the greatest challenge. But I think the really, really important thing here is to use our skill as educators to try and support those students in any way we can with whatever experiences they're having. So question and get them to think, because they've got brains, they can think for themselves. And that's really at the core of learning. It's trying to process and understand whatever experience they're having actually means to them as they develop and move forward in their lives.
Yeah, awesome. That question from Liliana, she's actually from Mexico, Richard. So there you
Wow.
go. We are global today. And then Naomi's also sort of reflected that she's got the same situation with refugee students who also have limited resources. So I'm just going to sort of lighten the mood a little bit now and just get you to tell us about what's the top book you've read. What would you recommend from a reading perspective for our community?
You know, listen, I'm going to do this and it's not going to sound like a marketing exercise. It's not my books, although obviously they'd be fabulous to read. Funnily enough, the last trip I had to Australia in February, I met another one of Saxton speakers, the amazing Sabina Reid, who I think you did a fireside with the other day. And she pushed me in the direction of the book by Bronnie Ware, who again, I suppose as a Brit, I hadn't come across before. And it's the top 5 regrets before dying. Now, I know that sounds a bit morbid in the current climate, but for me, it's an extraordinary book of hope and optimism and about all those things in life we should be making sure we do more of it when we're alive and breathing. And funnily enough, you know, I started reading the book before the COVID thing really exploded, but my goodness me, it's given me such an optimistic perspective on what I could and should be doing right now with the time I have. So I'd suggest it to anybody.
All right. So just say the name of the book again.
It's The Top 5 Regrets Before Dying by Bronnie Ware.
Perfect. Awesome. Now, tell me, have you got a guilty pleasure or something that you're doing to support the local, you know, you've got a favorite takeaway or something you've got going on over there in England?
Do you know, we're not taking away, because I'm going to be really virtuous here. I was carrying way too much weight over the last, for any of you that have met me over the last couple of years. So I've decided I'm going to be one of the people, as long as I don't contract this thing, I'm going to try and come out of this healthier than I went in. So we're eating lots of fresh. I've lost 2 stones in weight since Christmas.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. I'm hurt no one noticed.
You look fabulous.
Bless you. But we're supporting by buying local, buying fresh, buying local, and I'm using a lot of the time, as I said, to cook. So I'm cooking from fresh as much as I can. And the other industry I am supporting without any apology is the Jack Daniel's bourbon industry, which is one I feel we need to keep afloat, and I'm trying my best to do that personally.
Very good. I'm trying to support Matt Jones and Four Pillars Gin. So
there you go.
And then just sort of name one thing, given everything that's been going on with COVID-19, that you just won't ever take for granted again.
Hugging.
Yeah.
Hugging. I'm a very touchy-feely person in the right way, and hugging, just being around people and being able to express emotion and feeling, and that being togetherness, but hugging. I get to hug my wife, but I've been doing that for 30 years, and my children, and they don't let me anymore. Hugging people, just being close to people. That's definitely so if I meet any of you in the next few months when we're out of lockdown, be careful, because I'm coming for you.
We look forward to a great big Richard Gerver hug. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. I know the community that is on has really enjoyed your really valuable insights into what's going on, particularly from an educational perspective. There's still a couple of questions, so I might share those questions with you post, and we'll post them up on our LinkedIn site so that people can still get the answers.
Perfect. Yeah, great.
Right. Take care. Stay safe.
Take care, everyone. Yeah, and
we'll
you. Thank you all so much for taking the time. It's great to see you all. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Richard. Bye. Bye, everyone.